There is something in us that sort of protests against a perceived unfairness in any situation. What do you hear on the playground between kids? That's not fair. And if you're watching a game and it seems that to you that the refs are favoring the other team as opposed to yours, you're screaming at the TV, that's not fair. And if you're pulled over for speeding while the other people who are going faster than you are just whizzing on by, again, you're screaming into yourself, that's not fair. Well, when you look at this part of the story of Jesus, you ought to be screaming, that's not fair, right? Because this part of the story ends with Jesus dying on a cross. And Jesus didn't do anything deserving of death. In fact, Jesus didn't do anything wrong ever. That's not fair, is it? But there's something in this whole situation that's just kind of amazing to me about what happens. See, when I experience unfairness, I rail against it, I scream against it, and I run away from it. But Jesus here, he ran toward it. Jesus actually ran toward the unfairness, and not only that, he pretty much kept his mouth shut for the whole entire time. Jesus saw this unfairness coming, and he willingly and deliberately carried that unfairness all the way to the cross. Endured that unfairness all the way to the cross, all because of his incredible love for us. So let's get into the narrative. If you're following along, I'm in Luke chapter 22 and Luke chapter 23. Now at the end of chapter 22, Jesus is rejected by the religious establishment in not one but two trials full of all sorts of legal holes that a first-year law student couldn't have driven a truck through. But Jesus, the sinless, selfless Son of God, he said pretty much nothing as they railroaded him and passed a death sentence and sent him on to Pilate for the Roman rubber stamp. The unfairness of it all. And then as chapter 23 opens, Jesus is going to be rejected by the government and also rejected once again by his own people and religious leaders who should have been cheering for the Messiah, this time in a very public setting. I'm starting at verse 1 of chapter 23. Then the entire assembly stood up and took him to Pilate. And I want you to understand here that Pilate wasn't a political cripple. He'd had a 10-year tenure already in a place that chewed up and spit out governors. So he had some political skill, but he also had made some political missteps along the way. And several times he run into trouble with the Jews, and that word got back to Caesar. So now Pilate's on probation from Caesar, and the Jews know that, and they're going to use that to their own advantage. Beginning at verse 2, going on, they began to accuse Jesus by saying, "We found that he stirs up trouble among our people. He keeps them from paying taxes to the emperor, and he says that he is Christ, a king." Now the Pharisees' issue with Jesus wasn't political. The charge was blasphemy. And that's a religious charge, not a political one. It's against religious law, not against Roman law. But they knew that a blasphemy charge wasn't going to mean anything to Pilate. He was just going to laugh him out and kick him out. So what did they do? They changed the charges. Now, that's not right. That's not fair, but they did it anyway. And Jesus says nothing. Going on to verse 3. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, I am," Jesus answered. Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, I can't find this man guilty of any crime. All right, now at this point, right, Pilate should actually stop the trial, shouldn't he? He's made his public statement. He's issued sort of a summary judgment, if you will. Again, he says, I can't find this man guilty of any crime. And Pilate's the judge and he's the jury, so why not release Jesus then and there, right? It would be the just and the fair thing to do. But there is nothing fair about anything that's happening to Jesus here. And Pilate's kind of feeling the heat. And if it's Jesus or if it's Pilate, Pilate's going to choose self, like pretty much everybody else would. And the Jews know it. And so, again, they ramp up the pressure. Reading along at verse 5, the priests and the crowd became more forceful. They said, he stirs up the people throughout Judea with his teachings. He started in Galilee and has come here. When Pilate heard that, he asked if the man was from Galilee. When Pilate found out that he was, he sent Jesus to Herod. Okay, political guy, political solution. Change of venue. Change of venue. Make it somebody else's problem instead of standing by what you've already said. I can't find this man guilty of any crime. Which again screams unfair. Why are you putting this guy through that when you've already made the statement? And Jesus silently goes along. When he could have simply walked away, or he could have crushed his accusers. Jesus, and then as he's going to Herod and he's there, he's not treated with any sort of decency that you would expect. I'm jumping down to verse 11. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt and made fun of him. They put a colorful robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. And what did Jesus do to deserve that? I mean, nothing. I mean, in fact, Jesus' reputation among the people as a good and a decent man who was a good teacher, who helped people and he healed people, that should have counted for something, shouldn't it? But it didn't. Again, that is so unfair. As is what happened when Herod punted back to Pilate. I'm jumping down now to verse 13. Then Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people. He told them, you brought me this man as someone who turns the people against the government. I've questioned him in front of you, and haven't found this man guilty of crimes of which you accuse him. Neither could Herod. So he sent this man back to us. This man hasn't done anything to deserve the death penalty. So I'm going to have him whipped and set free. Now, this is the second time that publicly Pilate says that Jesus is not guilty, that he's innocent, and yet he still doesn't let him go. Once again, that is totally unfair. And once again, through it all, Jesus is just silent. And the whipping, I'm going to have him whipped and set free? I guess I sort of understand what Pilate was doing there. The whippings were brutal. And Roman soldiers were particularly skillful at inflicting the maximum amount of pain and suffering and agony in that without quite killing the person. And I think Pilate's hoping that when he brings Jesus back out and the people see him and he's tortured and he's battered and he's half dead and he's standing before them, that maybe the leaders are going to rethink their position and say, okay, that's enough. He's no threat to us anymore. He's not going to do anything. What harm can this pathetic figure be? But so while I understand why Pilate maybe did it, guys, Pilate's the government, all right? And as the government, he's supposed to stand up for justice. He's supposed to stand up for right. He's supposed to stand up for the rule of law, and he's already ruled this man is innocent, like twice. So why punish Jesus if he's innocent? You don't whip an innocent man. I mean, if he's innocent, what you do is you set him free. And Pilate doesn't. And in fact, he punishes him instead. So unfairness on top of unfairness on top of unfairness. And once again, Jesus is silent. He just stands there and pretty much takes it and says nothing. The crowd, on the other hand, that's there gathered around there, well, they've got plenty to say. Now, this is probably not the same group that shouted Hosanna on Palm Sunday. After an extra long Passover day, they're probably still sleeping out there on the Mount of Olives this early in the morning. So this particular crowd has all the marks of a group of paid agitators who were told what to say and when to say it and how long to keep on saying it for. See, the Jewish leaders were out to get Jesus. And so they didn't want to leave anything to chance. They know Pilate's vulnerable to pressure, so they pay these agitators to be there and put even more pressure on Pilate. I'm reading now down at verse 18. The whole crowd then shouted, "Take him away. Free Barabbas for us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison for his involvement in a riot that had taken place in the city and for murder. But because Pilate wanted to free Jesus, he spoke to the people again. They began yelling, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time Pilate spoke to them. He asked, "Why? What has he done wrong? I haven't found this man deserving of the death penalty, so I'm going to have him whipped and set free." But the crowd pressured Pilate. They shouted that Jesus had to be crucified, and they finally won. Pilate decided to give in to their demand. He freed Barabbas, who had been put in prison for rioting and murdering, because that's what they wanted. But he let them do what they wanted to Jesus. He let them do what they wanted to Jesus. All right, God established government to protect justice, and instead it railroads his own son. Once again, this is totally, totally unfair. And as for the prisoner exchange, I mean, Barabbas is guilty of, quote, rioting and murdering, which in that time meant he deserved a death sentence, and the guilty one is set free. And the innocent one is sentenced to die in his place. Again, totally, totally, totally unfair. And once again, Jesus is pretty much silent. And there is still more to come. Much, much, much more. I'm reading now down at verse 32. Two others who were criminals were led away to be executed with him. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him. The criminals were also crucified, one on his right and the other on his left. So Jesus, who was declared guilty, even though he's innocent, is now publicly branded as a criminal. Right? Crucified between two other criminals, so that anyone coming out to watch the blood sport wouldn't see an innocent man dying for the guilty, wouldn't see the Son of God giving up his life for the sins of the world. They wouldn't see what Jesus was doing at all. All they would see were 1, 2, 3 criminals. 3 criminals who must be guilty, right? Otherwise, why would they be there? A battered, beaten, bloody mess, whipped within an inch of his life, and now stripped literally of the last shred of human dignity. And that's not fair either. I mean, someone should see what Jesus is doing here. Somebody should notice a sacrifice that great. Somebody should honor that kind of a sacrificial love, and nobody does. Not at the time. In fact, I don't think anyone at the time even sees or knows what Jesus is really doing here. Those of his friends and followers who made it back to that area, well, they were just shocked and devastated at what was going on. And if some of those Palm Sunday crowd who had been shouting Hosanna happened to make it out to the hill outside Jerusalem, and they happened to recognize Jesus among those three, they were probably wondering what had happened to make a celebrity fall so far from grace so fast. And those who wanted him dead, or who just enjoyed the sport of death, well, they just kept piling it on, heaping on the insults again and again and again. Reading now at verse 34. Meanwhile, the soldiers divided his clothes among themselves by throwing dice. The people stood there watching, but the rulers were making sarcastic remarks. They said, "He saved others. If he's the Messiah that God has chosen, let him save himself." The soldiers also made fun of him. They would go up to him, offer him some vinegar, and say, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." A written notice was placed above him. It said, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging there insulted Jesus by saying, "So you're really the Messiah, are you? Well, save yourself and us." And through all that unfair treatment, Jesus is mostly silent. He does nothing to correct them, nothing to tell them that they're wrong, nothing to point out what he's really doing there, the innocent one dying in place of the guilty one so that the guilty ones could be set free. He says almost nothing. Well, he's not quite silent. All right, Jesus does speak a few sentences from the cross, and Luke records 3 of them. Here's the first one. It's at verse 34. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Forgive them. That first word, that first phrase of Jesus from the cross, as Luke records it, is not about fairness. It's about grace. God's undeserved love for us in Jesus Christ. Forgive them. I mean, after how they've treated him, after how they've conspired against him, after how they've manipulated the circumstances to get a conviction, after how they've treated him both before and during both of the trials, after all the insults they've heaped on him, after all they made fun of him, after how they've physically abused him, after all how the Jews and the Romans both seem to delight and revel in his pain, the fair thing for Jesus to do here, the fair thing would have been to call curses on them and ask the Father to destroy them, like some sort of a lightning bolt variety thing from heaven. That would have been closer to fair, closer to what we might call justice, closer to a this for that retribution. But Jesus doesn't choose that kind of fair. Jesus instead chose grace and mercy and forgiveness when he himself experienced none of that. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. The second phrase is really in a similar vein. The second word Luke records is preceded by one of the criminals saying this. I'm reading at verse 41. "Our punishment is fair. We're getting what we deserve. But this man hasn't done anything wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now the fair thing, according to our usual way of thinking, would be for Jesus just to say, well, no. No, you've been too bad too long to make up for all the stuff that you've done. Or, no, you need to do a few more things to prove that your repentance is genuine, and you're there on a cross. You just don't have time for that anymore. But again, Jesus chooses mercy and grace over fairness. Here's Jesus' reply, verse 43. Jesus said to him, I can guarantee the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise. Today. Not in a little while. Not in a long while. Not in 1,000 years from now. Not in 1,000,000 years from now. But today, Jesus says. Today. See, Jesus doesn't make anyone who repents wait for forgiveness. He offers it right then and there, freely, no strings attached. Again, grace, mercy, forgiveness. That's what comes from Jesus' heart. Which brings us to the ending of this part of the story. I'm jumping down to verse 44 right now. Around noon, darkness came over the entire land and lasted until 3 p.m. The sun had stopped shining. The curtain in the temple was split in two. Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. After he said this, he died. Now that darkness there at noontime, the darkness that's closing in at a time when it shouldn't be dark at all, it's almost as if all of creation here is being unglued. And maybe in a way it sort of is, because what's happening here is Jesus, the eternal, the almighty, the immortal God, dies. And as he dies, Satan, the prince of darkness, appears to be triumphing over the light of the world. But he's not. Right? Satan's moment of triumph was actually very temporary. Because what Satan didn't see coming here was this. Satan didn't see that all this unfairness actually brought about forgiveness. Right? Satan didn't see that through his innocent suffering and death, Jesus would actually free us from sin and death and the power of the devil. And he didn't see that the ripping Jesus' life would actually reconnect us with God and give new life to us. I mean, the tearing of the temple curtain that's referred to here, that's a graphic illustration of that. Because the tearing of the temple curtain means there's no more barrier between people and God. That through Jesus we have forgiveness. That through Jesus we have direct access to God. And with the death of Jesus, there's no more sacrifices that are needed, because Jesus is the one final perfect sacrifice and offering. And Jesus took the punishment for sin upon himself so that anyone who asks for it could be forgiven. No preconditions, no strings attached. And that's not fair. All right, none of it was. But it was all necessary. And you know what? As we look at that last sentence, that last phrase that Luke records here, Jesus speaking from the cross, we see that all the way to the end. Even through all that chaos and darkness and seeming unfairness of it all, that Jesus is still in control. Always was, and always will be. But here's what he says, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. I entrust my spirit. Jesus' life isn't ripped from him. It isn't taken from him. Jesus is telling us here, I willingly, freely, through all this unfairness, I give up my life for you. And I'm entrusting it into the hands of the Father. And through Jesus willingly, freely, voluntarily giving up his life, God did the impossible and the incredible. I mean, back in Luke chapter 1 and 2, we saw that God in Jesus becomes a man. And now we see in Jesus in chapter 23 here that the eternal God in Jesus actually dies. That he dies, that he willingly and freely and voluntarily gives up his life for us. Jesus did that all for us so that everything necessary for our salvation was finished. Now, if we look back again at this part of the story, there's some things that, well, this whole forgiving others who are crucifying him, that doesn't seem right. In fact, it sort of offends our sense of fairness. The ones hurting Jesus should be hurt themselves, like really badly, or at least, if not hurt, not forgiven. And as far as offering last-minute forgiveness to a career criminal, well, that offends our sense of fairness too. If you're going to forgive him, we think he should have to work it off, right? Spend some time in some sort of a special place for like maybe a really long time till he can start to make up for this a little bit. And it should offend our sense of fairness when we see that, like Barabbas, we're the guilty ones. We're the guilty ones who were set free, and Jesus, the innocent one, the holy one, exchanged his life for ours. No, there is not a lot of fairness any place here in this part of Jesus' story. But I'm thinking maybe that's what Luke wants us to see. I'm thinking that maybe one of the big points that Luke wants us to see is that forgiveness isn't about fairness. Let me say that again. Forgiveness isn't about fairness. Forgiveness is free. Forgiveness is free, and it's freeing for us. It was very costly for Jesus, but he gives it to us freely. And forgiveness is about freedom. Okay, freedom from guilt, freedom from regret, freedom from the power of the past to keep us from reconciling with God, freedom from the power of the past to keep us in chains or to keep us from reconciling with others. And forgiveness is about a choice. Forgiveness is about a choice to do what's necessary to repair the relationship, whether what you have to do is fair or not. You see, that's the way Jesus looks at things. The way Jesus looks at things, forgiveness has never been about fairness. It's about sacrificial and unconditional love. And when I start to forgive others a little more like that, instead of insisting on fairness all the time, well, then I'm starting to live and to love a little more like Jesus.